Hello, everyone. This is Josh and Dan from Monastery Dropouts. Welcome. So we want to talk about the ego today. We were talking about it off camera, and we realized that it's an interesting topic, and our experiences of the ego is different than what we were taught. And so we thought we would go into that today. Dan, do you want to start and tell a story about your experiences of the ego?
Well, I'm going to start with a interpretation of a biblical story. When I was a child, I remember learning about the story of God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And as a child, I was horrified. And the Sunday school teacher said, "Well, Abraham so loved God, he was going to do it." And I thought, my God, that's insane. And I could not really be convinced otherwise. Now my understanding is that the meaning of that tale is that Abraham had to be willing to sacrifice everything for God, and his son would represent his ego. And that's the interesting thing about when you are going through a process of spiritual awakening or enlightenment, is you have to be willing to let your ego die. Your ego feels like it's going to die, but then you find out, well, no, my ego isn't really destroyed. It's just the identification with it is removed, and the ego remains, and eventually it becomes Christed through the process of purification. So the ego isn't really, and so that the story really made sense then in that context. Oh, right. He had to be willing to sacrifice his ego. But then at the time of enlightenment, God says, well, you don't have to actually destroy that. You just had to be willing to let it go.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
that's, yeah.
and what I was taught, and I think a lot of people are taught, is that maybe from the Buddhist tradition or something like that, is that the you must like basically sacrifice the ego or sacrifice your sense of self, and then if you're willing to do that, then um, then you can reach like enlightenment or those higher states of consciousness. And when I've experienced those higher states of consciousness, you realize that your ego remains. It's just and what we had talked about is that in day-to-day life, your ego may be, for a lot of people, maybe 99.9% of who you think you are. It's like your identification with this little body, this little self, and like the conditions around it, like the culture you live in, like what your body looks like, your thought processes and the values of your culture, those types of things. But in those higher states of consciousness, depending on where you're at, your ego may be like 10 or 25% of who you perceive yourself to be. And the other like majority is this like wider awareness, this wider consciousness. And the biblical quotes that, or the biblical aspects that we had talked about is the book of Revelation. It talks about how the lamb must be sacrificed in order for the seals to be opened. And I'm going to do a longer video on this, so I'm like in a deep state of meditation and talk about each aspect of it. But there's seven seals and there's seven chakras in your body, and in those same verses, there's seven candles or seven lights, and only the lamb can break those seals and open them up. And the lamb is associated with Christ in the book of Revelation. And the way that can be interpreted, and the way I see it, I think the way Dan experiences it as well, is that there's Christ consciousness and it's always there. And the lamb is the ego presence. And so the ego is a part of the Christ consciousness. But you must let that ego die in that sense in order to move further into the Christ consciousness. But when you're in those deeper states and you feel completely expanded above and beyond your physical presence, the ego is still there. And I've heard someone say that uh, that God presence or that higher self presence and the ego, they become teammates and they're working synergistically together. And my experience of that is that it's a really powerful experience where you go way up above your body and there's like this little small space and you go into that, and all of a sudden everything opens up and your consciousness is very spherical and you kind of have like this single eye that's like but it's a sphere. It's like you can see in 360 degrees around it. But the odd thing is you're way up there and you can see all this stuff, but then you can be like, oh, I have a body, and you can look through your physical eyes, but you can still feel all of that presence so far above you, and then you just feel like this power radiating down. Um, and so the ego isn't like, I think there can be an idea of like you need like almost like hate yourself, and I think
Mm.
like in the dark ages of the middle ages, like people would like whip their bodies and like try to destroy themselves in a way, or like they'd be like cutting off body parts because like they caused them to sin or something, and that's obviously like pretty dark stuff.
Yeah.
um but the idea is that letting go of attachments, letting go of aversions, letting go of judgment, that's like those are big parts of what your ego is, and like those can dissolve away. But your sense of self remains. Like you don't dissolve into
Right.
nothingness.
Right. And yeah, the more your ego gets purified, the more it can work in cooperation with God and your higher self.
Yeah. I think we both wanted to talk about that a little bit and give people an idea of the biblical aspects of the ego. But then the idea that it's important to love yourself. And
Right.
when you can truly, truly love yourself, then you can move into those higher spots. But it's not that like love of like getting things and like feeding yourself more and more, like that
Yeah.
hungry ghost. Um, it's loving yourself at like the deep levels. So this is Monastery Dropouts. That's Dan, and this is Josh. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.